Welcome everyone to the National Park Service Presents. I'm just imagining a lot of clapping right now, lots of clapping. This is an amazing online series that we just started last year. It came from, we were in person. I don't know if you noticed, pandemic hit, we moved online. And then we've kind of really enjoyed it being virtual, and we're happy that a lot of people have decided to join us. So this runs every other Tuesday at 6 p.m. all the way until April 26th. So we hope to see you in 2 weeks as well. This series covers an entire crazy amount of topics, and today's is being about the amazing Mary Edmonia Lewis. But before we begin with the presentation, I do want to go over some of our Zoom features. We are recording, much to my chagrin, with my beautiful intros, but it's exciting for everyone else. But so you can catch this presentation and a couple weeks ago presentation and even some of last year's as well on the Boston Public Library YouTube page. The best way to find it is to honestly Google Boston Public Library YouTube, and you'll see it right there, and you can see the entire playlist, which is super fun. You will notice you have a chat button at the very, very bottom. If you have a question, just totally pop your question in the chat. Be aware of the chat, like notice, I can't even talk anymore, guys. This is how nervous I get. I'm gonna take a pause. Here we go. Please notice when you're typing in your question, who you are typing it to, whether you're typing it to the host and the panelists, or you're typing it to everyone. You can absolutely type to everyone. Like, don't be shy, it's fun. But just be respectful, that's all we ask. And your question might not be answered immediately. They are getting gathered at the end, and Ranger Sean's going to come back on the screen and moderate all of your questions. So without further babbling from me, because that's what I love to do, I'm going to give it away to Ranger Chariot. She presents Carving Out Her Own Path. Woo.
Thank you, Karen. So as Karen mentioned, I'm Sherry Guillen, and I'm a park guide with the National Parks of Boston. And before we start our program, I just want to tell you a little bit about the National Parks of Boston, for those of you who might not be familiar. So the National Parks of Boston is made up of 3 parks that are located within the Boston area. And those include Boston National Historical Park, which is the sites that are located along the Freedom Trail. And these are sites located in downtown Boston, Charlestown, and South Boston. Then we have the Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park, which is made up of 34 islands and peninsulas, including George's Island, Spectacle Island, all kinds of other islands that you can visit when it's nice outside. And then we also have Boston African American National Historic Site. And this is home to the Black Heritage Trail, which is roughly around 1.5 miles. And this goes through the neighborhood of Beacon Hill in Boston and focuses on the history of the free Black community who lived here and was really involved with the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad in Boston. Okay, so now back to the program. So today we're going to be talking about the life and career of Edmonia Lewis. And so for those of you who might not be familiar with Edmonia Lewis, she was the first sculptor of African American and Native American heritage to achieve international recognition. So before we start, I'd like to ask you to consider a couple of questions as we go through this program. So first is, how do you identify, or how do you define your identity? And how does our identity shape the way that we see ourselves and others? So I'll just give you a minute if you want to feel free to share any of your responses in the chat. All right, so the way we identify ourselves can play an important role in our lives. Shared identities can lead to building connections, which can help us create a sense of belonging to certain groups. Identities also help us shape our self-image. But sometimes identities can also be used to kind of confine or restrict what people are capable of achieving. Lewis was a person who refused to be limited or defined by her racial or gender identity. And this is really what allows her to achieve this international success. As she stated at one point, "Some praise me because I am a colored girl, and I don't want that kind of praise. I had rather you would point out my defects, for that will teach me something." Now, if we go by the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition, identity is essentially who someone is. So who was Edmonia Lewis? Well, the short answer is that Lewis was a woman who reached remarkable success as a sculptor. Not only did she succeed at a time when women were limited in opportunities, but she also did this at a time when African Americans were seen by many as a, quote, inferior race. The long answer is it's complicated. This was a woman who reached global fame at the height of her career in the late 1800s. Her name was constantly in the papers, and she gave several interviews during her life. However, the details in her narratives were not always consistent, and the more you learn about her, the more questions you have to ask. Now, this could be due to a couple of different factors. At times, it appears that the people that she spoke to or who covered her work sometimes could not see beyond her racial identity, and as a result, we find that her talent is often overlooked by her racial background. However, some scholars actually argue that Lewis likely embellished some of the aspects of her identity at different points in her life in order to advance her career. So in this program, we're going to be exploring her life, her artwork, and the racial and gender barriers that she faced in her journey to become a sculptor. So as I said, details about her life are a little bit inconsistent, but it's believed that she was born around 1844 to an African-American father believed to be from Haiti and a Chippewa or Ojibwe mother. Unfortunately, and that's about where that is, it's in the Albany area of New York. And so unfortunately, her parents die at a pretty early age, and so she's orphaned as a child, and she is raised by her maternal aunts. So she spends a lot of her childhood and kind of spending a lot of time outdoors. So she's fishing, swimming, and the way that they make their livelihood is by making and selling crafts. And she later actually credits some of this creative craft work as an inherited trait from her mother, and maybe one of the reasons why she might have been drawn to the arts. And so you get this quote from her saying, "When my mother was dying, she wanted me to promise that I would live 3 years with her people, and I did. I did as my mother's people did. I made baskets and embroidered moccasins, and I went into the cities with my mother's people to sell them." So they were really making a lot of sort of like souvenirs for tourists in the area as a way to make money. Now, in addition to her maternal aunts, she also had a brother named Samuel. And Samuel, during the gold rush, goes out west, and he actually makes a fortune in California. And so this newfound wealth enables him to help Edmonia Lewis sort of pursue an education. So she begins her studies at New York Central College in McGrawville, New York, which is located right around there. And so this is where she starts off her education, and she later says that at this school, she was declared to be too wild and that nothing could be done with her. So she ends up at Oberlin College in Ohio. So in 1859, that is when she enrolls in the school. And Oberlin is a school that is famous for being among the first institutions to admit both women and African-American students. And they're also really known for their strong commitment to the abolition of slavery. At the time that she enrolls, she's about one of 30 African-American students that is listed as enrolled. And the same year that she enrolled, this is actually the same year that John Brown leads his raid at Harper's Ferry. So just to give you a sense of kind of where things are at politically in the country. And at this time, she's also boarding and rooming with the Reverend John Keep, and she stays there at this home with about a dozen or so other white girls. Now, Reverend John Keep, he is a trustee of Oberlin, and he is a staunch abolitionist who actually cast the deciding vote of the school on when they were trying to decide whether or not they were going to admit African-American students in 1835. So definitely a person who holds influence and power with the school. Now, even though Oberlin is seen as a pretty progressive school for its time, women are still being educated to become mothers, wives, and teachers. And so that's kind of what Edmonia Lewis's education is centered towards, but she does take a drawing class during her time here. And this is likely where she's first exposed to some of the fine arts. And this is actually where we get evidence of some of her kind of artistic leanings. And we have a drawing of her from here at this time period that is actually based off a sculpture and is titled Urania. And so that's one of the earliest known works of Lewis. And this is given to a friend of hers as a wedding present. And so that's kind of how things are going at Oberlin up until 1862. And so in 1862, on January 27th, that winter, they're kind of at a school recess, and two of Edmonia Lewis's friends are getting ready to head out on a sleigh ride with two gentleman friends. And Lewis invites them to her room for some spiced wine before they go out. And so the women go out, and then when they come back, it turns out they're really sick with a lot of stomach pain. And so this leads to an examination, and the doctors suspect that they have been poisoned. So Lewis is actually accused of poisoning both of her friends with drugged wine. Now, even though she has been accused, Oberlin is a bit slow to act, and the local community is sort of impatient to see her punished. And so you have a local mob assault her, actually. And so you have this quote from John Mercer Langston of that event. But essentially, one evening as she's leaving home, she is kidnapped and she is dragged to a nearby field where she is physically assaulted and pretty badly beaten. Now, she's later that day discovered missing, and a search party goes out, and they found her lying in the cold with her clothing torn, and again, her body is pretty badly beaten. So unfortunately, the identity of the mob members is never revealed, and no action is ever taken against them. Now, following this event, she is arrested and she is brought to court, and she actually has to show up to trial on crutches because of how she is still recovering from those injuries that she received. And during her trial, she is represented by a man named John Mercer Langston. And John Mercer Langston is actually also an alum of Oberlin, and he goes on to become one of the first African Americans to hold an elected position. So during the trial, he is able to successfully argue that there is insufficient evidence in this case, and he is able to successfully have the charges dropped, and Edmonia Lewis is acquitted. And so he later writes about this event, and he says, quote, "The end came, and the orphan, friendless, young colored woman, as many called her, who had been accused, perhaps without reason, and thus outraged without cause, was carried in the arms of her excited associates and fellow students from the courtroom, to which she had been brought of criminal and popular esteem, to her home, fully vindicated in her character and name." So this kind of paints like a kind of a happy ending for Lewis, you know, even though she was accused and had gone through this terrible ordeal, she at least had been proven innocent. But unfortunately, she continues to face further instances of racial discrimination, and she is later accused of twice stealing art supplies at Oberlin, and eventually she is banned from enrolling in her last semester and is unable to graduate from the school. And so this leads her to Boston. Now there's a couple of different accounts that indicate how she might have gotten to Boston. Some people suggest that Frederick Douglass had urged her to go to Boston. Others say that she was given letters of introduction to William Lloyd Garrison. But either way, Boston was definitely a great place for Edmonia Lewis to sort of pursue her career in art for a couple of reasons. There is the abolitionist movement, which is really kind of centered in Boston, and where she will be able to receive a lot of support from the people there. And then there's also a community of artists there that might be able to help her. And so that is essentially what happens. she is introduced to the local sculptor Edward Brackett, who she kind of studies under, and he starts to teach her some of the basics of sculpting. Now, what's interesting is this quote here on the side is what Edmonia Lewis initially says when arriving in Boston and what had brought her there. But later on, a story kind of develops where she was eating crackers on the steps of the old State House when she saw a statue of Benjamin Franklin, and she called it a stone man because she didn't have any words for what it was. And this is a story that gets repeated by a lot of people around the time. But it's unlikely that this actually was true, just because, like, as I mentioned earlier, that she had already had evidence of being exposed to the fine arts at Oberlin. And so this might be one of those cases where she sort of is embellishing on her past or on her identity to sort of appeal to a wider audience, or what people kind of expected from her racial identity. So she starts to work out of a studio on Tremont Street, and this is a studio building, which is also where a lot of other artists were working at the time. And one of her first works is a medallion of John Brown. And so unfortunately, there's not any photos of this medallion, but just to give you an idea of what a medallion looks like, it's this like coin-shaped piece of art with like a profile of a person in the middle. And so this one over here on the right is actually one that she does of Wendell Phillips later on in her career. And this is kind of what she starts off doing. She's doing medallions. It's kind of good practice for sculpting. And she's also focusing on a lot of the abolitionist heroes of the time. And she's receiving a lot of support from abolitionists. And so she's quickly mastering the basics of sculpting. And then she eventually becomes really determined to sort of create a bust. And so one of these busts is of Robert Gould Shaw. And it kind of highlights some of the complicated relationships that she sometimes had with her patrons. So one of her patrons was a woman named Lydia Maria Child, who was a women's rights activist, also an abolitionist, wealthy woman who had a lot of connections in Boston. And she serves not just as a patron, but as a mentor. So she offers her a lot of advice and encouragement, and she really champions her work when she first gets to Boston. However, at other points, she also really tries to kind of discourage her at times from doing certain pieces of work. So in the case of the bust of Robert Gould Shaw, Edmonia Lewis initially reaches out to Lydia Maria Child, and she asks her for a photograph of Robert Gould Shaw so that she can model her bust of Shaw. Now, Shaw was the commander of the famous 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which was one of the first regiments made up of all Black men to be raised in the North. And Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, he died during the Battle of Fort Wagner, and so he was really seen as this really important figure, a martyr for freedom, as she has inscribed at the bottom. And so Lydia Maria Child didn't trust that Edmonia Lewis would be able to kind of complete this work. She didn't think she was ready. However, Edmonia Lewis decides to kind of disregard her advice, and she continues on and she makes this bust of Shaw, which turns out to be really well received, including it gets a lot of high praise from the Shaw family themselves. And so Lydia Maria Child, she later calls the bust quite remarkable. And so here you have her kind of, down here, you have her saying, that she had tried to discourage her, but that she was kind of proven wrong. But you also have another instance of her kind of sounding patronizing towards Lewis, and also always kind of linking her artwork to her racial background. So another quote from her later is that when she was looking at it with another woman, we both, quote, "We both felt that there was something inexpressibly beautiful and touching in the efforts of a long oppressed race to sanctify the memory of their martyr. Indeed, I think the deep feeling of admiration and gratitude which the artist felt for the young hero whose lineaments she traced was one great reason why she succeeded so well." So She does the bust of Robert Gouldshaw. It is really successful, and she actually goes on to sell about nearly 100 copies at about $15 a piece. And just a note that this bust is actually on display at the Museum of African American History, which is one of our partners. So if you're ever interested in seeing that, you can go there and see it. But she also does a bust of Sergeant William Kearney, who was an African American soldier in the 54th, which unfortunately is now lost. And some of the other works that she does of Black abolitionists include Reverend Leonard Grimes of Boston's 12th Baptist Church and Reverend Henry Highland Garnet of New York, another abolitionist leader who unfortunately we don't have photos of those works because they are now lost. So the financial success that she achieves from selling those busts of Robert Gouldshaw, this allows her to move to Italy so that she can hone her skills as a sculptor. Now, there's a few reasons why she wanted to move to Italy. Rome was really the place for sculptors to be at the time because of the abundance of marble. It's a great place to study different artwork there. And then there's also a really vibrant community of artists over there. Now, Edmonia Lewis, she also wants to escape the limits that are being placed on her due to the color of her skin. So you get this quote from her here saying, "I was practically driven to Rome in order to obtain the opportunities for art and culture and to find a social atmosphere where I was not constantly reminded of my color. The land of liberty had no room for a colored sculptor." So before she sets off for Italy, she actually spends some time teaching newly enslaved people in Richmond, Virginia. And then here, her suitcase is actually stolen. So it appears in the newspaper, and that's how we know that she was in Richmond, Virginia. And she eventually settles in Rome in 1866, where she becomes part of a community of high-profile female expatriate artists, which include Charlotte Cushman, Anne Whitney, Harriet Hosmer, and other women who have really paved the way for Lewis as female artist. And so you have here on the left, Harriet Hosmer, and she is surrounded by a lot of assistants, people who would have helped her kind of create some of her works. Now, this group of women was really they were really defying gender norms of the time through their financially independent lifestyles and in their physical appearance, which included wearing their hair short and wearing masculine clothing. These women were also offering each other emotional and professional support. So these women really embraced Lewis and kind of take her under their wings and try to help her establish herself in Rome. And so some of these women in this group are also engaged in same-sex relationships. Charlotte Cushman, who is a famous actress, she had several well-known long-term relationships and affairs with women. And so this association and other aspects of Lewis's life have led some scholars to question Lewis's own sexuality. Now, there's no direct evidence to support this, but what is interesting is that I did come across a couple of newspaper articles that mention an engagement for Edmonia Lewis, and then one that even refers to her husband, but there's never any name mentioned, and you never hear about it again. It's just maybe like 3 instances or so. So it does raise a few questions, you know, did Edmonia Lewis spread this news to maybe dismiss rumors? Was this kind of just tabloid news being created just to sell papers? It's likely that we may never know how Lewis might have defined her own sexuality, but it is important to remember that some of the ideas and language that we use today might not necessarily apply in the same way to other time periods, but it's good to, you know, think about what this would have added to her story if this were the case. So her career really flourishes in Rome, and she opens her studio in 1866, and a lot of her works are being done in sort of a neoclassical style of work. And so she's drawing a lot of inspiration from some of the classical culture of ancient Greece and Rome. And the style is typically defined by symmetry, a life-size scale, and a serious subject matter. And so popular subjects at the time range from mythological figures to heroes of the past and present. And so you kind of see Lewis kind of continue that trend and And she also starts to incorporate other themes into her work. So you have themes of like emancipation, liberation, literature, history, all those things kind of being incorporated into her work. And one thing that is kind of unique about Lewis is that she was really known for carving her works herself with no studio assistance. And this was due to a couple of things. People at the time were in disbelief that a woman, of color could kind of create some of these masterpieces. So this was a way for her to really show that this was her artwork, that she was doing it, and that, she had no one else could kind of claim that they had a part in the artwork that she was producing. And this was especially impressive considering that she was only about 4 feet tall. So this was a lot of work, but she was known for not using any studio assistance at the time. And so she continues to do work that had a lot of meaning for American audiences and that kind of reflect her own dual heritage. And so you have the old arrow maker here on the right, which is based off the poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the Song of Hiawatha, which illustrates the character of Minnehaha and her father. And they're both supposed to be looking up at Hiawatha here. And it's interesting because Hiawatha, the character, is also from the Ojibwa tribe, which was her mother's tribe as well. So Edmonia Lewis's studio really becomes a fashionable stop for people who are visiting Rome. So Henry Wadsworth Longfellow actually visits her studio, and she even does a bust of him, which is now at Harvard. And Frederick Douglass as well also visits her studio. And throughout the 1800s, she frequently travels back and forth to showcase her artwork. And so she goes to places like New York, San Jose, regularly comes back to Boston, and she also goes to Philadelphia. And even as a famous sculptor at this time, she's still facing racial discrimination in instances where she's turned away when she's trying to find a place while traveling. And so in 1876, we kind of get her grand masterpiece, which is the Death of Cleopatra. And so Lewis was invited to display this piece of work at the International Exposition in Philadelphia. And this piece attracts a lot of attention, and it weighs a little more than 3,000 pounds. And so a lot of people find this portrayal really shocking, and for its like realistic portrayal of Cleopatra's death. And even though it gains a whole lot of attention, it does not end up being sold, and it actually ends up pretty lost for a while. And so it's a really interesting history, and it actually becomes recovered and sold to a gambler who had a racehorse named Cleopatra. And so he places it on the gravesite of his horse, and it remains in a racetrack, and then it eventually goes through all kinds of different changes, which is a golf course, the mail center, among other changes. And then at some point, a Boy Scout troop tries to paint over it in an attempt to sort of fix it. And then in 1988, it is discovered by a historian, Marilyn Richardson, who had received a tip from a museum that a collector had this artwork. And so she goes to identify it, and it is indeed discovered to be a work by Edmonia Lewis. And it was actually in the storage space of a shopping mall. And so today it is it belongs to the Smithsonian Museum, and it was very weather worn just because it was of the location of where it was for so many years. And so they did a bit of restoration work. It's not perfect. Like you can see that some elements of the faces here are still pretty weathered, but they did the best that they could. And so after this, after especially 1900, you kind of don't really hear too much about Lewis anymore. You have this like paper here asking, can anyone give me any news on Edmonia Lewis? Like I haven't heard anything about her in such a long time. And so she kind of fades into obscurity, and not much is really known about her later years of life for a really long period of time. However, you do still find instances of Lewis's name being brought up, especially in newspapers for African Americans, and she is, regularly being listed as examples of African American achievements. And Edmonia Lewis definitely is always kind of someone who is inspiring to people. And this was, I think, something that she knew herself. And so you have this quote at some point in her career that she gives. She says, "I have supported myself ever since I made my entry into its circles. Sometimes the times were dark and the outlook was lonesome, but where there is a will, there is a way. I pitched in and dug at my work until now I am where I am. It was hard work though, but with color and sex against me, I have achieved success. That is what I tell my people whenever I meet them, that they must not be discouraged, but work ahead until the world is bound to respect them for what they have accomplished." And so some of the details that we didn't know for a really long time were even where she, when she had died. And so in 2011, actually, a 1901 census record is uncovered by the historian Marilyn Richardson. And this actually reveals that Edmonia Lewis had relocated from Rome to London. And so research continues, and it is uncovered Lewis's wills and her burial records. And it turns out that Edmonia Lewis died on September 17th, 1907 at the Hammersmith Infirmary in London of Bright's disease, which was a kidney illness. And in her will, Lewis identifies herself as a spinster and a sculptor. And so initially her gravesite is unmarked, but in 2017, a GoFundMe campaign is started to restore the headstone at her burial site. And so that is now, as you can see, restored, and she is still buried at St. Mary's Roman Catholic Cemetery in London. And so this kind of brings us to today. So today, several of her works are on display at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C. Other places where you can find her work include Harvard University, Mount Auburn Cemetery, Howard University, and other places across the country. In this year, actually, the United States Postal Service announced that Edmonia Lewis was going to be featured on the 45th Black Heritage Stamp Series. So this stamp here is based off of a photograph of Lewis when she was in Boston. And it's actually done by the Black artist named Alex Bostic. And Alex Bostic recently gave an interview kind of talking about some of the connections that he felt with Edmonia Lewis. And he said, quote, "Edmonia Lewis was a perfect subject for me because of what she went through to be an artist, particularly as an African American. Educating the public is something that is greatly needed in the Black community. People need to know about our heritage and what we're capable of achieving." And so I think most people would agree that that was one of the important legacies that she had, but also it highlights some of the importance and the significance of representation, even though she sometimes had such a complicated relationship with her identity. And so that is the end of my program. And so, yeah, if anyone has any questions, I'd love to hear them.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Sherry. That was a very enlightening presentation. Definitely did not know as much about Edmonia Lewis. So again, appreciate all the research that you put into this. So again, folks, if you do have any additional questions, we do have a couple. So I'll go through those first, and then if anything else comes up, obviously we can go through those. So I think one of the first questions, if you could speak to kind of, you said at the very beginning, you were talking about identity, and the fact that she may have embellished a little bit of her identity. And someone wanted to know if you could speak a little bit more to that. Why do you think that she did embellish some of her identity?
I guess what I have seen from other historians is that they kind of suggest that it was sort of as a way to kind of, because this was something that people were interested in, she was sort of unique for her time. I mean, even today, she's pretty unique, but people were constantly asking her, bringing up her race and when talking about her artwork. So you have these instances where she's saying, "I was born in a wigwam. I was roaming, wild and free in the forest." And at some point she's saying that her name was Wildfire. And it's kind of, it's not to say that any of that was not true, but because her story kind of changes several times, and because some of these things, such as like saying that she had never seen a sculpture before seeing the statue of Benjamin Franklin, I think you kind of see that she was maybe creating sort of like an artistic persona, so that people did find interesting, even though she maybe didn't always, want that to be like the center of attention. But she still recognized, obviously, that it did kind of pique people's interest, and so I think that's why maybe you kind of get some support for that argument.
Great, thank you. So then I have another question, and I'm gonna it's a couple different things, so I'm gonna kind of try to pull them in together. So the question was a little bit more particular, wondering if she was in Rome when Sarah Parker Remond was, and then kind of expanding upon that a little bit, was just kind of curious about the community that Edmonia Lewis was in Rome, and kind of wondering if that community included someone like Sarah Parker Remond, who was, a strong advocate for women's rights, and wondering if that there was that really kind of tight network that might have been pushing back against norms and kind of breaking traditions in Italy at that time.
That's a great question. I'm not too familiar with when Sarah Parker Remond was in Rome, but Edmonia Lewis was there from about 1865-ish to about 1900. So it's possible. I can't speak too much to how strong her connections were to the abolitionist communities that were over, but I do know that she still continues to sculpt a lot of figures, and then whenever she does travel back to Boston, she is still meeting with very prominent abolitionists in different communities, such as Reverend Leonard Grimes, and she's actually does a bust of him and presents it with him. She even at some point sits and gets to do a bust of Ulysses S. Grant. So she definitely had a lot of connections. And then, as I mentioned, Frederick Douglass stops, I think on his honeymoon, to visit Edmonia Lewis's studio, and they spend some time together. So I'd be interested to learn a little bit more about that.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so then wondering, and if you don't know, wondering if you know anything about who might have started that GoFundMe campaign to fix in the gravestone.
I cannot quite remember her name right now, but it was actually someone from around the community where she was likely born. So it's in New York. I think it was someone involved in a historical society. Yeah, I can't remember the name of the town, but that's who started the GoFundMe campaign.
Great. And then this is two questions here. One, do you have any idea why she moved to England? And two, did she ever write an autobiography?
Well, yeah, it's because we don't really hear much about her. I don't know why exactly she moved to England, but I've read a lot of some of other historians' works on Lewis, and some people suggest that some of the things that were happening in Italy might have prompted her to move to England. There was, I think, some tension with I forget what country in Africa, I'm sorry, but there was some conflicts going on at the time, and actually, I think from what I remember, some really sort of racist things going on, and so that might have kind of prompted her to leave and find another place where maybe she wasn't having to deal with that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And then, sorry, did she end up writing an autobiography, or was it just kind of could you speak a little bit to some of the sources that you used for this, and kind of how you pulled this presentation together? Because I think it's pretty obvious that you know, there was a lot of material kind of scattered around, but being able to kind of pull it comprehensively into this presentation, something that definitely takes a lot of work. So could you speak to your methodology a little bit?
So no autobiographies, unfortunately. That would be so amazing. But what I did come across from her, like from herself, was a lot of newspaper interviews that are featured. So some of them with Lydia Maria Child, some that are featured in kind of like abolitionist newspapers, a lot of interviews with her. And of some of the sources, so that was like a lot of the bulk of my sources was kind of newspaper articles that mentioned Lewis. You also get a lot of letters that are written to some of the people who are supporting her. So one of them being like Maria Weston Chapman, where she is kind of, you know, inquiring about some of the works that she sold. She kind of had a tendency to sometimes mail pieces of work or kind of ship off pieces of work before anyone had actually kind of agreed to purchase them. So that's one of the instances I saw where she's kind of inquiring of like, hey, do you know anything about this piece of work? Like, is it going to, has anyone purchased this yet? You know, kind of getting updates. And a lot of art historians as well have, you know, contributed to research and why we know so much of Edmonia Lewis today. So some of those include, like, as I said, Marilyn Richardson, who discovered the Death of Cleopatra, and then also, you know, found out when she had actually died. And then there is also, I think, a work done by Albert and Henry Henderson. And then there is also Kristen Buick. Those are some of the 3 sources that I really relied on, in addition to some of those primary sources that I could find.
Great. Yeah, that Death of Cleopatra story was amazing. That was to be able to recover that's awesome. Okay, so then another question that just came in the chat is, did she have benefactors, donors? How did she stay afloat?
So as I mentioned, one of her like major supporters was Lydia Maria Child, but because of that like complicated relationship that they had sort of like a tension where Lydia Maria Child would really be kind of pushing a lot of her own advice, kind of trying to like rein her in, be like, you know, you're not ready for this, trying to suggest other things that she should focus on before she advanced to some of these like larger pieces of work that she did. And so eventually they kind of do stop, kind of their relationship kind of ends. And so that relationship was kind of important, but she also has a lot of female supporters who are, you know, who travel in really influential groups. So Maria Weston Chapman is another person. And then it's just several other people who, you know, had the money to purchase these things. There's also, I think, an African-American family who is able to commission a piece of her work. A lot of churches as well, where they bought a lot of her works. So like, as I mentioned, Reverend Leonard Grimes, they purchased a bust of him. So yeah, those are some of the names that I have. And when she is in Rome, she also has a lot of connections to some of the nobility there. And actually, I think the Pope visits her studio, and then she finds a patron, the Marquis of Boot, if that's how you pronounce that. And so she definitely finds a lot of ways. I think at some point she also, when she's in Rome, is kind of playing more to the people who are kind of touristy. So she does incorporates a lot more like religious things into her work as well.
Great. So we have kind of a broad question here, but how was Edmonia Lewis received in the African-American community during her life? And I'm thinking probably like Boston, New York, and you know, other areas that she may have traveled.
So most references that I've seen, especially like in the newspapers, when they talk about Lewis, was definitely sort of, it's like she was like a source of pride for people. They wanted to have works from her. They wanted to support her in her career. There is one instance that stuck out to me was a group of African-American women who were searching for an African-American artist to portray a significant or like an important African American at a fair, and they end up choosing Edmonia Lewis, and the person that they asked her to do a piece on was Phyllis Wheatley. And so I just thought that that was like a really, a cool story, and kind of shows the significance of what Edmonia Lewis meant to people at that time.
Yeah, real sense of pride. That's awesome. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I think, Sherry, I can give you last word here, and then we can turn it back over to Karen to close us out.
Yeah, so I'll just put in a plug for a couple of upcoming programs that we have. So the next lecture series is going to be on March 1st at 6 p.m. and that is titled Taxation Without Representation is Tyranny. And so that's the next session in this lecture series. And then on February 26th at 10 a.m. there is going to be if you want to learn more about Edmonia Lewis, a special event. This is being co-hosted by the Friends of Mount Auburn Cemetery and Longfellow House, and this is a virtual event to celebrate Longfellow's birthday. And so this is going to focus a little bit on Lewis, her time in Rome, and the connections that she had with Longfellow.
Awesome. Well, again, and with all the accolades coming in the chat, I think I can speak for everyone and say that this is a really wonderful presentation. And you gave everyone a lot to think about, so that's fantastic. And with that, I think we'll turn it back over to you, Karen, to close us out.
I'm speechless. It was really good. I'm just in awe. I'm just doing a lot of processing myself. So honestly, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. And honestly, I'm going to keep doing my own research a little bit. So cool. So really, thank you again. And hopefully I'll see everyone back here on March 1st. It's actually the beginning of Women's History Month. And that's why we'll be starting with Taxation Without Representation is Tyranny. And I believe it's about the women's, I have it here, the Women's Tea Party of 1873. Thank you again. See ya.